Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
It was an unbelievable upset at the Qatar 2022 World Cup when Argentina took on Saudi Arabia, with Saudi Arabia emerging as 2-1 winners despite initially going behind to a Messi penalty, thanks to goals by Al-Shehri and Al-Dosari. Saudi Arabia made the most of their shots, scoring with 2 out of 3, with an overall XG of just 0.14, whilst Argentina had 2.27. But what tactics were on display? Let's take a look. If you're interested, this video and several others usually go up early for early access on Patreon, so if you want to check that out, head over to patreon.com/footballmadesimple, and it helps to support the channel. Argentina dominated the ball with almost 70% possession, so we'll start with them on the ball and Saudi Arabia's brave defending. Saudi Arabia were happy for Argentina to have the ball in their own third. However, they never dropped too deep and instead lined up in a mid-block 4-4-2. And this block actually had quite a high line. In possession, initially, Argentina would play with a 2-3-5, with both of the fullbacks maintaining the width but staying fairly deep, and either Paredes or De Paul becoming the single pivot, whilst the other pushed up into the front line alongside Messi and Martinez as the Argentines looked to overload Saudi Arabia's back line. In recent years, when teams have used this formation, they have either lined up with both fullbacks inverting to create a 2-3-5 or dropped one of the fullbacks into the back line, allowing the other to be the second pivot alongside the initial pivot. The reason for this is that it allows multiple options in the midfield, making it much more difficult for teams to shut down the central play. However, Argentina insisted on keeping their fullbacks fairly deep and wide in this first phase, and Saudi Arabia lined up in this mid-block 4-4-2, and initially, both forwards would be happy to sit on the single pivot, and this would allow their central midfielders to drop much deeper, which would help to compact the space between the lines where Messi and the man who had pushed up from midfield were looking to operate. Whilst Argentina's shape also meant that the fullback and the wingers were often in the same vertical line, which could cut down the passing angles available. So this was the rough Argentina shape. A back two, fullbacks who remained deeper and wider whilst there was a single pivot, and in this case it is De Paul who is pushed higher up the pitch, and into the front line alongside Messi, Lautaro and Di Maria, who's providing width alongside Papu Gomez. And Saudi Arabia had a good defensive shape, with a 4-4-2 that looked to keep the spaces fairly compact between the midfield and defense, whilst the front two could tie up the single pivot. So by maintaining a mid-block, Argentina could have easier possession in their own third. However, once it got into the midfield, it was heavily contested, meaning that it was much harder for Argentina into Saudi Arabia's own third, so most of the game was played in the midfield. And this is where Saudi Arabia's shape could look vulnerable at times, as if the front two were either too concerned with cutting off the single pivot, it would mean that the Argentina centre-backs would have a lot more space available. This high line, combined with no pressure on the ball, would mean that the centre-backs would have time to move higher up the pitch and get their head up, whilst the forwards would make runs, where they could then look to find them. But luckily for Saudi Arabia in this match, the pass was often too late, leading to an offside, or it was short and could be intercepted aerially by a centre-back. But for the most part, Saudi Arabia's front two were effective, in that they would initially cut off the single pivot, but as soon as a centre-back began to move forward, one of the men would confront the man on the ball, making this a much harder pass to execute, whilst the other then moved to sit on the pivot. And if the ball switched centre-backs, this would just go the opposite way. So initially, the front two are cutting off the pivot as usual, but as Romero begins to move forward with the ball and looks to get his head up to execute the pass, a forward comes to confront him, whilst the other then picks up Paredes. Saudi Arabia's general defensive shape was also helped by their wingers, who were willing to defend much more narrow at times, as Saudi Arabia were willing to allow the Argentina fullbacks to have the ball, as they were much less of a threat. These narrow wingers once again would make it much easier for Saudi Arabia to be much more compact in central zones and make it much more difficult for men between the lines to be picked out. So to get on the ball, at times we would see that both Argentina pivots could be dragged into much deeper areas, and this was not ideal for Argentina as there would be no connector in the midfield to be found to then find the forwards higher up. But no defensive shape is perfect, and Argentina were able to have some success, particularly when DePaul dropped into this zone, especially once Paredes went off, and the secondary pivot maintaining their usual position. What this modified shape would mean is that when a centre-back was found and the forward was pressing as they always were, now DePaul would be an option out on this right-hand side in a little bit more space. If the winger was still wide on the Argentina fullback, this would now create a rare scenario where the Saudi Arabia midfielder was drawn out of position, creating space in this zone that Argentina could look to use to pick up a man between the lines, who would then look to play in the runner going in behind. In this case, Paredes has dropped into the back line, but the principle remains the same, having 3 against the front 2. This means that when the forward presses the centre-back as they usually did, now there's an extra man free on the outside, who can then look to move higher up the pitch. In a rare scenario, the central midfielder is now dragged out of possession as they look to confront them, leaving more space in the midfield. So, the single remaining Saudi Arabia central midfielder is outnumbered by the Argentine midfield, and this creates the opportunity for them to combine. This is a slightly different scenario where the fullback is able to get on the ball and this time the winger is drawn out towards them. The crucial thing is the same as a Saudi Arabia midfielder is drawn out of position as they look to press, and this time DePaul looks to move into the resulting space. So now when he receives, he can turn and look to play in Martinez making the run in behind, although the keeper sweeps up well. But the key thing for Saudi Arabia is by being so compact that made it difficult for men to find room between the lines to turn and play freely. But in the second half, especially once Paredes went off, DePaul had much more responsibility from this deep region. And where in the first half he was rather static, looking to make the difference by passing when he had this space, in the second half he became more dynamic, and when he received here, would look to drive up the pitch. With the midfielders looking to remain compact on the central threat, it would mean that the winger was now often drawn towards DePaul, which would then open up the opportunity for Di Maria to be 1 versus 1 against the left back, and time and again he made the run down the outside, put in dangerous crosses, but no one was there to finish. This back 3 shape became more and more common, with DePaul being the right centre back, and this is a scenario where the Saudi Arabia forwards are unable to immediately apply pressure, whilst both pivots are deep, looking to monitor the men between the lines. So now DePaul is able to drive higher up the pitch, and the winger has one eye on him, so he is able to find Di Maria in the wide region, and he then finds the runner in behind, who can get a dangerous cross in, but to no avail. Saudi Arabia didn't attack too much, but let's take a look at what happened when they did have the ball. From goal kicks, they generally looked to go long, and their wingers would tuck into the center of the pitch, which would draw Argentina's own wingers much more narrow. At the same time, both fullbacks were fairly aggressive in pushing high up the pitch, and could become the long ball targets from the goalkeeper. And in fact, they had the second and third most touches for the side. And in open play, Argentina defended in a fairly loose 4-4-2, with Martinez having more onus on pressing, as Messi is aging and doesn't have the legs to do so for 90 minutes. However, with a less intense press, it led to some disadvantages for Argentina, as often the number 8 could drop in between the centre-backs to now have a 3 versus 2 situation. And subsequently, when the forwards did look to press, it wasn't the most intense press, so he could move into the midfield, so that now Saudi Arabia had a 3 versus 2 and could keep possession quite well, leading to some dangerous situations. So Argentina are in a 4-4-2 and Messi is less involved in the press. This means that the Saudi Arabia pivot can look to penetrate between the two forwards and move into the midfield, and the Argentina pivots are looking to remain man-to-man. But now with the 8 having moved back into the midfield, Saudi Arabia actually have the 3 versus 2 advantage, allowing them to combine, which would then allow them to get in on the wrong side of the Argentina pivots and drive higher up the pitch. Overall, Argentina were not at their very best, not creating too much and wasting what they did. Saudi Arabia's brave defending paid off in the end, and will now be hoping for previously unlikely qualification to the next round. For the manager tactical score, Scaloni earns a 4, unable to get his side into consistently dangerous shooting and creating positions. Although on almost any other day they would have come away with the win. Saudi Arabia lost on XG and rode their luck, but they were never really going to outplay Argentina quality-wise, but their tactics were still commendable and paid off in the end, meaning that Hervé Renard becomes just the second manager to earn a perfect 10. But what are your ratings? Drop them down below. And a special thanks to my latest patrons like Justin Robinson, 12, Bagat, Konstantinos, and Cesar.
But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.